All right, Alexander, let's do a quick video preview of the meeting between Biden and Putin, the video call between Biden and Putin that's going to take place within a couple of hours from when I post this video online. So let's just do a very quick preview of this, and then after the phone call, we'll probably do a more in-depth breakdown as to what was said or what was agreed upon. And let's just start with, I think, the most basic question that is on everyone's mind, which is, does Russia have 175,000 troops amassed on the border of Ukraine, ready to invade in January, as we are hearing from every mainstream media news outlets, the Pentagon, the Department of State, NATO, Stoltenberg? Everyone is saying that Russia is going to invade in January. Is this true?
No, it's not true. There are no 175,000 Russian troops on the border of Ukraine. In fact, there are no significant numbers of Russian troops on the border of Ukraine. I gather that European NATO member states who have been shown the intelligence have pushed back and said that they don't see any troops there. So there are no troops there, and there is no Russian plan to invade Ukraine.
That's simple. No plan to invade Ukraine. What would prompt Russia to invade Ukraine?
Right. What there are is that there are Russian troops, large numbers of Russian troops, in base areas, hundreds of kilometers located away from the border. They are positioned there so that they can respond rapidly if one of two things happens. Either there is a Ukrainian attack on the Donbass, or there is a violation by NATO of Russia's red lines. Those troops could then be redeployed to the border within days, and then, of course, they would be ready to launch a counteroffensive. Now, I want to stress that's the way round it would happen. There is no indication that the Russians are planning anything else, and in fact, a Russian official interviewed for the Financial Times has actually said as much, that those troops are there to respond to any action taken by Ukraine against the Donbass or conceivably by NATO in Ukraine.
Are there any indications that Ukraine is about to attack the east of Ukraine in the Donbass?
Well, there is constant skirmishing now going on along the line of contact, but there is no evidence actually of an imminent Ukrainian offensive. The Ukrainian military was repositioned to the contact line at the start of this year. It has remained there ever since, bogged down in trench warfare, becoming increasingly demoralized and losing, apparently, the ability to launch an offensive. And I base all this on reporting, by the way, by the London Times, whose journalists actually toured the Ukrainian front lines and reported on the state of the Ukrainian military they found there. The Ukrainians have used Turkish-supplied drones against the militia, but the overall impression is that they're not in a good state and they're not looking like they're in a position to launch an attack at the present time.
Okay, given all the facts that we know, why in God's name do we have this story now dominating the news cycle? The story being 175,000 Russian troops are on the border with Ukraine, ready to invade the country. And that invasion will take place in January. Why do we have this story everywhere in the news, all over the place? Everyone is talking about it. Why do we have this?
Well, let's first of all look at how this story began. It began several weeks ago with leaks by anonymous officials to the Washington Post and Politico claiming that the Russians were massing troops on the border. The Pentagon pushed back, said it had seen no unusual activity on the border. So, by the way, did Ukraine. They also said that they'd seen no unusual military activity on the border. Those anonymous sources then went on and persisted claiming that the troops were being massed on the border. Eventually, everybody fell into line. First the US, then Ukraine, then, of course, European governments, then the rest of the media. So it is an entirely concocted story. Who is concocting it? Clearly, it's hardliners in Washington, and I suspect that they're following a number of agendas. Firstly, they want to get a green light for a major delivery of arms to Ukraine. So they want tension to escalate in order to greenlight this delivery. And the kind of weapons we're talking about apparently are the weapons that would have been supplied to the former Afghan army, and they're going to be redirected to Ukraine. So we're talking about Humvees, possibly helicopters, not helicopter gunships, small arms, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, Javelin missiles, that sort of thing. A large delivery. I mean, we're talking about, hundreds of millions of dollars of arms, perhaps even $1 billion worth of arms, but something of that kind. Not enough, however, to change the military balance. There is that. The second is that I think they're becoming increasingly concerned by the political situation within Ukraine. The economy is deteriorating. There's increasing talk that President Zelensky's position is now becoming threatened. There's a meeting of Ukrainian oligarchs in Vilnius, and they're apparently preparing to oust him, or there's talk that they might be preparing to oust him. And of course, overarching everything, there is worry about Nord Stream 2, the fact that it is likely to be certified in the spring, and the fact that the Russians are adamantly refusing to reconsider an extension of gas transit via Ukraine post 2025. So I think that the hardliners feel that this is the moment when they've got to make one last bid to stop Nord Stream 2 getting certified and to bolster support in Ukraine for Zelensky himself, and also to try to bolster European support for Ukraine. Bear in mind that there's been recent opinion polls in Ukraine, which, contrary to everything that you've been reading in the media, suggest a strengthening of support for a rapprochement with Russia. 40% of Ukrainians now apparently say, including an increasing number of young Ukrainians, say that Ukraine and Russia are the same people, as Putin has said. So this is a situation which clearly is becoming increasingly dangerous for the hardliners, and they've created this crisis in order to abort developments that they don't like.
Right. Diverting military equipment and weapons from Afghanistan, what were meant to go to Afghanistan, to Ukraine.
Yeah.
That's the one goal. Propping up or trying to save a disintegrating presidency and perhaps a disintegrating country, definitely a disintegrating economy. That's the other goal. And of course, Nord Stream 2, which we've documented in many videos. And that's going to really deliver a big economic hit to Ukraine. Now, Blinken is the person that I remember that was really pushing this way back during the Politico story, about like a month ago, if I'm not mistaken, maybe even more. But it was Blinken that was pushing this, and it wasn't gaining much traction. And like you said, it then started to gain a lot of traction. Who do you think, though, was behind Blinken in giving birth to this story? Because Blinken is not smart enough to come up with all of this. No. Who do you think was telling Blinken, okay, Blinken, here's what you're going to go out and say. Here's what you're going to push. Now run along, little boy, and start pushing it.
The people who are pushing it, and I think it's become increasingly clear over the last few years, going back to the information we got at the time of the second impeachment, are hardliners within the State Department. Some people in the State Department, well, the State Department overall seems to have been completely captured by the neocons during the period of the of the Clinton administration, and ever since, and they have been running this Ukraine project as their own. The U.S. Embassy in Kiev is incredibly hardline and determined to support Ukraine and to save this disintegrating project as much as possible, and they've been reinforced by political hardliners who've been brought back into the State Department by the Biden administration, namely and specifically Victoria Nuland. She went to Moscow. She had apparently a very difficult time there. She found the Russians utterly resistant to everything she had to say on Ukraine, on economics, on military affairs, on diplomatic representation in both countries. She apparently left Moscow in an absolutely furious mood. Biden, or some people around Biden, got so concerned that they sent the CIA director, William Burns, who's a more sober figure, to try to patch things up. But anyway, what she's done and what the people around her within the State Department have done is that they whipped up this storm in order to try to, as I say, bolster the position and save what is now clearly a failing project.
Yeah. Didn't Nuland also go to Ukraine with Blinken
Yeah,
at one point
absolutely.
in time?
Absolutely. She
I
absolutely.
wonder who's working for who. I wonder if she's working for him or he's working for her.
Well,
Anyway,
I'm going to say straightforwardly. I think I'm going to say it very straightforwardly. I mean, remember, she's far more experienced and far better and far better connected than he is. So I think she's the organ grinder and he's the monkey.
All right. Great way of putting it. Okay, so we're going to have the call. They're going to talk about stuff, right? We know what they're going to talk about, but sanctions definitely are going to be on the table. I'd be surprised if the U.S. doesn't place more sanctions on Russia after the video call. What do you think those sanctions will be, and do you think they're going to go with the nuclear option, which is the SWIFT?
I don't think they're going to do that right away. And I think some of these sanctions that we've been hearing about are probably going to be held back because the Europeans don't want them. I mean, the Europeans do not want a disconnection of Russia from SWIFT because it's going to hit their own businesses, it's going to complicate their own matters, it's going to make things even worse. But the sanctions that have been talked about, the big sanction, essentially, is disconnection from SWIFT. There's been some talk about preventing the Russians converting rubles into Western currency. I don't understand how that's possible anymore, but regardless, there's apparently no steps being considered against Russian oil and gas exports. So essentially, disconnection from SWIFT, Russians would shrug their shoulders at that. They pretty much have said so. What I expect we're going to see over the next couple of days is not these big dramatic moves. I think they're going to be held back in preparation for this Russian offensive, which isn't going to happen. I think what we're going to see instead is we're going to see some further sanctions against individuals close to at the center of the Russian government. Maybe the prime minister, maybe some prominent business people, people like that. Sanctions which are completely ineffectual and have never affected anybody and have made no difference.
Right. Do you think that Russia's going to get their demands met? Do you think there's any chance whatsoever?
No, they're not. I mean, they're not going to get their demands met. I mean, what the Russians have done is that they've exploited this crisis. They've turned it round and they've said that what they now want is a binding treaty that there will be no further eastward expansion of NATO. Now, what they've managed to do as a result of saying that is that they've thrown that issue on the table and they've actually got us into a situation. They've got Biden, the administration, the Europeans, for the first time talking about that possibility. And even in the Financial Times, which is neocon central in terms of media here in Britain, there was a British writer, a British journalist, Gideon Rachman, who actually admitted that that is in fact a reasonable demand. That's a reasonable demand. Ukraine isn't joining NATO. It's never going to join NATO. The Russians have said that's a red line for them. So there's no chance of Ukraine ever joining NATO anyway. So why not concede that? Why not accept that with the Russians? Because that will stabilize the situation. And you're not actually conceding anyway anything substantive anymore. But Biden isn't going to agree to that. Over this phone conference with Putin, because he knows that if he does, his political position will be immediately undermined. His poll ratings are falling. The neocons will be furious with him. The Republican hawks in Congress will be out for blood. So he's not going to do that. But what might happen is there might be an agreement to negotiate a new security architecture or something of that kind. And that might in time, in 5 years and 10 years, evolve into something like what the Russians have put on the table now.
All right. Do you think that these things that the U.S. is looking to achieve, the neocons, what they're looking to achieve, for example, getting the weapons to Ukraine, or maybe delaying Nord Stream some more, helping
Yeah,
Zelensky stay in power, helping the government stay in
yeah.
power, are these an existential threat to Russia? Will achieving these goals that they're looking to achieve, will these prompt Russia into action to invade Ukraine, or Russia will just shrug these things off as well?
Russia will shrug all of these things off because they're not an existential threat. What would be an existential threat would be if the United States started sending really powerful heavy equipment to Ukraine, Abrams tanks and things like that in large quantities. And of course, if it started to position missiles and that kind of weaponry in Ukraine as well under NATO control, that would precipitate a Russian response. A Ukrainian offensive on the Donbass would precipitate a Russian response. A decision by NATO to admit Ukraine into NATO, that too would precipitate a Russian response. All of these steps that we're talking about, they are attempts to bolster a failed project. Let's remember, all those weapon systems that were supplied to Afghanistan didn't help the government there. They're not going to help the situation in Ukraine because the situation in Ukraine is now beyond repair. And that's the reality of it.
All right. What I'm worried about, to finish out the video, Alexander, is that we are drifting towards a conflict between
Yeah.
Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and Russia, the US and Russia, call it whatever you like. I feel like we are drifting towards a conflict because someone somewhere is going to mess up and make a mistake.
Yes.
What do you
Yes.
think the chances of that happening are? And in my view, that mistake will probably be something like a strike on East Ukraine where you actually kill Russian civilians in the east, because people need to remember that you have people there in the east of Ukraine now who have Russian passports and are effectively Russian citizens. So,
Absolutely.
a strike on the east and killing those people would be effectively killing Russian civilians. I'm worried something like that might happen because someone in Ukraine somewhere decides to go for broke.
Absolutely, that is exactly is a very high danger. I would even go so far as to say that in time it is a probability. Bear in mind, from the neocons have had a shock with the defeat in Afghanistan. They are terrified of a further US withdrawal from Ukraine. And all their various moves, if you want to sum it up, the aggregate of what they're trying to do is that they're trying to keep the United States and the West recommitted to Ukraine. If the situation in Ukraine is deteriorating beyond the point of retrieval, I mean, visibly so, and if the situation in Ukraine leads to hardliners taking over, people who feel that they're losing out as well, the United States might indeed be on the brink of pulling out or pulling back, then the prospect of a Ukrainian attack on the Donbass becomes extremely real indeed. Because at that point, they will feel that they have nothing to lose by going for broke. They might be able to bolster up again Western support and US support. And why not do it? Because if they lose, well, they're losing anyway. So they're just shortening the agony, if you like, and at the same time setting the scene for going down heroically, or as they would say, as they would like to imagine. So the probability of a war eventually is there. I will repeat again what I've said in other programs. At the moment, I don't think we're looking at a war this winter. But sooner or later, unless the situation is resolved, a war will come. Because you can't continue with a situation where every couple of months there's another rise in tension. Eventually, something will break. Either the United States will eventually pull out, but that would need a different administration, or more plausibly, the Ukrainians launch an attack on the Donbass, the Russians respond, and the situation is resolved in that way.
Yeah. I agree. We'll leave it there. Mainstream media outlets, they don't talk about the situation inside Ukraine. To me, that is the big tripwire. The disintegration of a functioning government in Ukraine is the tripwire.
Absolutely, and you're absolutely right. And it's interesting. They all talk in generalities and cliches. They don't report that opinion poll that I talked about. They don't report about the political situation, not at all, or the economic situation either. But consider just one fact. This is a country which, if you believe the media in the West, is supposed to be on the brink of an attack by Russia. There'd be no big anti-Russian protests in Ukraine. There's no masses of people coming out on the streets talking about how they need, are calling on the world to stand by them in the event of a Russian offensive. When Western journalists do actually speak to Ukrainians, as I saw them doing in the Financial Times and the London Times just the other day, none of them seem to be gung-ho or looking for war. The overall sense there is a demoralization, exhaustion, a sense of things falling apart, but that's not the picture that the West wants you to know about, or rather the media in the West wants you to know about.
And that's not the fault of Russia either, that they have these
No, it's not
domestic
the
problems.
fault of... No, of course not.
Yeah, that's something no one will ever admit in the Western media, that's for sure.
No.
All right, yeah. Okay, we'll leave it there. The Duran.locals.com and the Duran shop, 10% off when you use the code Good Day. Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, and Superuse, where you will find our videos. Take care.